All right, so this is our heart. Y'all would like staying way over there. This is our heart. Blood flow. And I know you guys have done this before, have seen this before. How does a flow of blood go? Who wants to do that? How does a flow of blood go? I know you guys know this.
Starts at the
Anyway,
Starts at the vena cava.
starts up here. Starts in our superior vena cava. You get to hold this piece. And it goes to where?
Right atrium.
Right atrium. So, no, that's fine. So the right atrium goes to where?
Tricuspid valve.
Through the tricuspid valve to our
Right ventricle.
right ventricle. And then to
Pulmonary artery. The vein.
pulmonary valve.
Valve. In there.
It goes through the pulmonary valve to what?
Pulmonary artery.
Pulmonary artery. And this is the only time, remember, that you're going to have, blue stands for what? Deoxygenated blood. So this is the only time the deoxygenated blood is going to get into an artery, is when it goes into the pulmonary artery. Then it goes to where? Lungs. So it goes to the lungs, which then goes back to
The pulmonary,
pulmonary vein.
which then is red.
Yep. So at this point now, it's gotten what in the lungs?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. So now we change to red. So he gets to hold on to the deoxygenated, and he also holds on to the oxygenated. Now it gets passed on as oxygenated blood coming through now from the pulmonary vein to the
Left atrium.
left atrium. Now you hold on to some of that, Kim. There you go. Goes through what?
Mitral valve.
Mitral valve into the
Left ventricle.
left ventricle, through the
Aortic valve.
aortic valve to the
Aorta.
aorta, and then
To the bottom.
out the aorta to the body. I know it's a little off scale, but it's the best I can. I want so you guys can see this. Would this really be over here? Where is this at? In here. Okay, it's in here. So this is the normal blood flow through the heart. Things that can affect this blood flow are what? What kinds of things can affect this? Ischemia. How would that affect that, Mary?
It could cause death in the tissue due to the lack of oxygen. It could cause necrosis down in the ventricles.
Okay.
Or a stiffening of the muscle.
So ischemia can cause death of cells, and how does that affect this then?
It's a break.
It's not able to contract.
Huh?
It's not able to contract.
Not able to contract as well. So if there's, say they've had a heart attack, here the predominant place is in the left ventricle. They have a heart attack. What's going to happen down here in the left ventricle then?
It's gonna get larger.
Okay, it can get larger.
Scar tissue and not be able to.
So then what happens here? Blood. Blood does what? Pools. So let's have some pooling down here. Yep. You just pass the blood down. You hold on to it. The blood's still going that way, but you let it go. All right? You hold on to this. Blood just backs up. This is how we back up. You got it here. All right? So the left ventricle just gets inundated with blood. You're all covered. Then what happens? When it gets inundated with blood, what happens here?
Backs up.
It can clot and back up again through the mitral valve into our
Left atrium.
left atrium. So some of that pulls back up into the left atrium. As it pulls up into the left atrium, what's it going to do? What can happen here now?
Backs up with the lungs.
It can back up into the lungs. What else can happen while it's sitting here in the left atrium?
It can pool and clot.
It can pull, it's going to pull and it can clot. So now it backs up into the lungs. So you just kind of back it up through the pulmonary vein into the lungs. When it gets to this point, Okay, you can stop.
Running out of blood.
When it gets to this point, what's gonna happen in that lung?
Demon.
Edema, where?
And
In the lungs. Why? Why does edema happen in the lungs?
Because of the valve flow. It's the backflow. I mean, it's meeting resistance.
It is
So it
meaning
can't
resistance,
go.
so what causes the fluid to get into the lungs? I know we've talked about this. What causes the fluid to leave the vessel and get into the lungs, into the tissues? Not osmotic. Hydrostatic pressure, remember that? Hydrostatic pressure pushes the fluid from the vessel, from that pulmonary vein, up into the lungs to cause pulmonary edema. This is also known as what? Left-sided heart failure. This is also known as left-sided heart failure. All because they had a heart attack that damaged cells and inhibited the ability of that left ventricle to contract. If you see something like hypokinetic, if you see the term hypokinetic, what does that mean? Decreased movement, yes. So you will find that sometimes on echoes, they will say hypokinesis of the left ventricle or the septum or the right ventricle or wherever that muscle part is that they're seeing the hypokinesis of. So if it's hypokinetic and it's not able to move as well, what's going to happen? If you have a muscle that's hypokinetic, in the heart especially, and it's not able to move as well, what's going to happen? Right, it's not going to contract, so you're going to end up with pooling. And that's one of the big side effects of somebody who's had a heart attack. And depending on how bad that damage is, of if that causes the hypokinesis. When you have that hypokinesis, how does that affect the ability of the heart then to contract? We just said that. It decreases, all right? So then they can end up with something known as if the heart's not contracting as well, what can that do? Decreased cardiac output, yes. It can also cause something that starts with a D. Dysrhythmia. If a piece of it isn't functioning well, then you can have something called a dysrhythmia. The cells that die can lead to a decrease in the electrical conduction. All right? So just continuing on this vein, we said this is left-sided heart failure. What else can cause left-sided heart failure? Besides a heart attack in the left ventricle, what else can cause a left-sided heart failure?
Problem with the valve?
Huh?
Problem with the valve?
Yes. Which one?
mitral.
Mitral valve. How about the aortic valve? Think about it. It's coming from the left ventricle through the aortic valve and out. If there's a problem with this valve, where's the blood going to go?
Ventricle.
Back into the left ventricle. If there's a problem with the mitral valve, where's that going to go? Left atrium. Eventually, both of them end up into the lung area. Who knew you were going to, that's why you're there. You're tall, you know. What kinds of things with these valves can cause this? Stenosis, which means what? Stiffening, narrowing of that valve. It doesn't open up as well. Which means how much is getting through that valve? Not very much. And so if the mitral valve is stenosed, it can't leave because it's coming from there down to here, so it can't leave through there, and it backs up into, stays in that left atrium. Same thing over here. If the aortic valve is stenosed, then it stays down here because it can't get through. These are a couple of things that can lead to that. What's the other piece that can happen with these?
Is it strep?
What does strep cause?
It's the bacteria.
Okay, so bacteria can damage the valves,
Damage.
yes. So the strep or any kind of bacteria can get on the valves, they call that vegetation, and damage those. So what's another piece besides stenosis that can happen here in the valves? Prolapse, okay, what does that mean? What does it mean?
It doesn't close properly.
Doesn't close properly. So you have that valve that's supposed to close, and it kind of does this number. It opens up. It doesn't close, and so it flips back into, say it's a mitral, it flips back into the left atrium. Or you could have it over here in the tricuspid and it would flip back into the right atrium. That's prolapse. And then what's the last thing that can happen with the valves? Regurgitation. And what does that mean, Shalitha?
That just means that the blood is flowing backwards
Right,
to,
because it doesn't
it's not
close. Okay, regurgitation means the valve is not closing, and so you have the backflow. It comes through. It comes from the left atrium through the mitral into the left ventricle, but it backs back up because this doesn't close. When this left ventricle contracts, the blood's going to go to the path of least resistance, and so you're going to get blood going both ways. And that's what happens in regurgitation.
That's why they do diuretics, to help take some of that strain off.
What is the diuretic going to do?
It's gonna decrease the volume.
Right, and that's where
There's
they,
no regurg.
yes. It doesn't necessarily mean they're not stopping the regurg, but you have less volume to tax that left ventricle. And you have less volume that's going to back up to that lung. So that's one of the treatments.
Is that regurgitation caused by any bacteria, or is it just a malfunction in the?
Bacteria can cause the malfunction of that vessel, of that valve. So it depends on what, it could just be over time, it could be bacteria. One of the biggest ones is, that can cause a problem with the valve, a childhood disease. Strep is one, rheumatic fever. Rheumatic fever is another one. So what they try to do then is they will repair these. And there's 3 different ways, though. If it's a prolapse, stenose, they'll go in and kind of stretch it to open it up a little bit. Sometimes they actually have to replace them. So it's usually an open heart surgery to go and replace them. I heard recently about heart cath in a sense. They did it through a heart cath, replaced the valve that way, so they didn't have to open them up. So the recovery time is a lot better. Things are changing, and you guys are going to have to keep up with those changes with that. So that's a left-sided failure. What's going to cause right-sided failure? COPD. Explain that to me. Who wants to help her out? How does COPD cause it?
Scarring the lungs.
Oh. What about it? Okay. Okay. Okay.
The exchange isn't there.
The exchange isn't
That's
there.
decreased.
What happens in COPD? Besides the exchange not being there, what happens in COPD? It gets bigger. The alveoli, the lung itself gets bigger. That's why you end up with barrel chest is one of the symptoms of COPD, the later stages. When that lung gets bigger, what does it do to the vessel, to the capillaries that's on the alveoli? Presses them. And can the blood flow through those capillaries? What's going to happen?
Decreased oxygenated blood.
Do what?
Decreased oxygenated blood.
Well, that's true.
It'll back up.
It'll back up. So, Brian, we have some blood backing up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I got excited about this.
And it backs up through the valve into our right ventricle. That's also called what? Right side heart failure is also called what? core pulmonale. Okay, that's also stop. So we get this backed up of blood because COPD presses on that vessel. It can't get through to get over here, so it backs up to here. When it backs up to here, what happens over here then? How does that affect the left side? If the blood's back in here, what happens over here? It's not getting there. So our cardiac output then is decreased. Now we're in the right ventricle. It gets full as it can. Then what happens? Backs up. Backs up. What are your signs and symptoms? JVD. Because when it gets into that superior vena cava, it's got to go somewhere, and so it backs up.
When this is going on for quite some time, that puts wear on those valves also.
Yes, it does.
Because it's making the valves work backwards.
Um,
In a way, it's
in a
because
in a
it's forcing it to
sense.
stay open to get the blood through. Is that?
That's a good question. In a sense it is, but what happens in the valve, in all of those, if you have the blood that's backed up in the ventricles, when that ventricle contracts, the blood will go both ways. It wants to go this way, but it can't quite get there. So it just backs it up here, but you got blood coming this way. So they kind of meet in that valve sometimes. I could see where that could damage. I haven't seen that as an indicator of damage, causing damage, but I could see where that could, because it's going to fight right there. It closes, so that
But it has
stops.
to work harder to close.
That's a good question.
Or because the pressure for both sides, it should.
It'll shut when the pressure on both sides is equal,
And it will be eventually.
eventually.
Yeah. As this is coming through,